The bailiff's voice hit the room before I even had time to breathe. All rise for the Honourable Judge Hale. I stood up from behind the bench, smoothed the front of my robe, and looked out at the courtroom. Rows of faces, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of old wood and recycled air. And there they were, third row from the front. My mother in a beige blazer she probably bought for the occasion, her hair done up the way she always wore it when she wanted to look respectable. My father in a dark suit, one of those clip-on ties. They were whispering to each other, and when they looked up and saw me, really saw me, my mother's hand gripped my father's arm so hard I could see her knuckles go white from 20 feet away. I had rehearsed this moment in my bathroom mirror at 6 in the morning for 2 weeks straight. I had told myself I would feel nothing. I was wrong. But I kept walking. I took my seat. I set down my notepad, and when the bailiff called the room to order, I looked straight ahead and breathed like they taught me in those stress management courses I took years ago, back when I was still trying to convince myself I was fine. I need to tell you how I got here, because none of this makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning started at a Greyhound bus station in Knoxville, Tennessee, when I was 6 years old. My parents were not cruel people in the obvious dramatic way. They didn't yell, they didn't throw things, they were just absent. Even when they were standing right in front of you. My father worked long stretches at a logistics warehouse 2 counties over, and my mother waitress double shifts at a diner on Route 40. I understood later that they were drowning financially. What I didn't understand, not until I was much older, was that they had already decided I was part of the problem. I had an older brother, Lyle. He was 9 when I was 6. My mother adored him in a way she'd never bothered to practice with me. I used to think it was because he looked like her, sandy hair, her same narrow face. I looked like no one. I was darker, quieter, always watching. The day it happened was a Tuesday in March. My father had told us we were going to visit my grandmother in Memphis. I remember being excited. I remember wearing my yellow jacket with the hood that had cat ears on it because my grandmother had given it to me, and I wanted her to see that I still wore it. We got to the Knoxville bus terminal around noon. It was loud and smelled like diesel and hot dogs from the vendor cart near the entrance. My mother was carrying a big tote bag. My father had a rolling suitcase. Lyle was walking close to my mother, the way he always did. My father stopped near a row of orange plastic seats bolted to the floor. He crouched down so he was at my level. He had kind eyes when he wanted to. That was the worst part. He told me to sit down and wait for them. He said they were going to get the tickets and they'd be right back. He said, "Count the bags that come through that door, count every single one, don't lose count, we'll be back before you get to 100. I remember the number, 100. I thought it would take about 5 minutes. I sat down and I started counting. I got to 117 before I stopped, before I understood that nobody was coming back. I sat there for 2 hours before a woman noticed me. Her name, I found out later, was something I could never fully remember. I just called her the lady with the red umbrella because she had this bright red collapsible umbrella hooked over her arm even though it wasn't raining. She sat down next to me and asked me where my parents were. I told her they went to get tickets. She looked at the main doors. She looked at me. She said, "How long ago?" I didn't know how to answer that. She went and found a station attendant, and the attendant called the police, and for the next 6 hours I sat in a back office on a folding chair eating crackers from a vending machine while adults talked around me in lowered voices and made phone calls and filled out forms. Someone gave me a colouring book with farm animals in it. I coloured the pig purple because there was no pink crayon. The police eventually reached my parents. I know this because one of the officers came in with a look on his face I now recognize as controlled, professional anger. He didn't tell me what was said, he just told me I'd be taken somewhere safe tonight. I never saw my Cadia jacket again. I left it on that orange plastic chair. For years I dreamed about it. What happened next was the foster system. I'm not going to tell you it was terrible, because the truth is more complicated than that. My first placement was rough, a house with too many kids and not enough attention. But my second placement was different. His name was Bernard Hale. He was 61 years old when I came to live with him. He was a retired civil engineer who lived alone in a 3-bedroom house in Chattanooga, with a yard that had an enormous oak tree and a vegetable garden he tended with the focus of someone defusing a bomb. He had reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and he drank decaf coffee every evening because he said regular coffee after 4 o'clock made him irritable, and he had no interest in being irritable. He was the quietest person I had ever met. Not cold, quiet. There's a difference. He didn't fill silence with noise. He let it sit there, and somehow that made me feel safer than anything else had. He asked me questions like he actually wanted to know the answers. Not the questions adults usually ask children, not how was school or what do you want to be when you grow up, but things like, what's something you noticed today that was interesting? Or if you could change one rule in this house, what would it be? I tested him constantly. That's what they tell you kids from disrupted placements do. We test. We misbehave just enough to see if you'll send us away. I broke a window once throwing a softball in the backyard. I told him the truth about it immediately because I was so scared that if I lied he'd have grounds to send me somewhere else. He looked at the broken window for a long time. Then he said, "We'll get that fixed Saturday. You're going to help me measure it for the glass." That was it. No yelling, no punishment, just, here's the problem and here is how we solve it. He officially adopted me 3 years after I arrived. I was 9. I remember sitting in the judge's chamber, a different judge, a kind older woman, and being asked if this was what I wanted. I said yes. I didn't have better words for what I felt. I just said yes. He put me through college. He drove 8 hours to see me walk across the stage when I graduated from University of Tennessee School of Law. He sat in the second row and wore his good blazer, and when I found him in the crowd afterward, he said, "There you are," like he'd never doubted it for a second. When I was 30, I was appointed to the bench in Hamilton County. He was the first person I called. I still remember exactly what he said. He said, "Bernard Hale. That'll look good in the papers." And I laughed so hard I had to sit down. He died 18 months later, cardiac arrest, in his garden on an August morning. The neighbor found him next to his tomato plants. He was 82 and he had done exactly what he wanted to do with his life. And I have to believe that counts for something. I flew home for the funeral. I handled the arrangements. I stood at the graveside in 90-degree heat and said goodbye to the only person who had ever made me feel like I was worth the trouble of knowing. 2 weeks after the funeral, his attorney called me. I sat in a conference room with a box of tissues I didn't think I'd need and then absolutely did, and she told me that Bernard had left me everything, the house, the investment accounts, the savings, everything. The total value was $3.8 million. I didn't know. I want to be clear about that. I had no idea. He drove a 2009 Honda Civic. He clipped coupons. He grew his own tomatoes. He had never once mentioned money to me, not in any real way. I found out through the attorney that he had made very smart long-term investments over the course of his career, and that he had lived simply on purpose. He had been, in the quietest possible way, rich for most of his adult life. I sat there in that conference room for a while after the attorney finished talking. Then I said, "Was there anything he wanted me to do with it?" She slid a sealed envelope across the table. On the front, he had written my name in his careful block letters. Inside was a single index card. He had written, "You always knew what was worth keeping. Trust that." I have that index card in my desk drawer. I look at it sometimes on hard days. 6 months after the reading of the will, I received a certified letter. It was from an attorney in Memphis, Tennessee. The letter informed me that my biological parents, both of them, together, jointly, were contesting the will, They were claiming that as my biological next of kin, they had a legal interest in the estate of Bernard Hale. I read the letter 3 times. Then I set it down on my kitchen counter and stared at the wall for about 4 minutes. Let me explain what I was feeling, because it wasn't fear. It was something colder than fear. It was the specific sensation of something you thought you had survived deciding to come back around. My biological parents had, after abandoning me at a bus station at 6 years old, filed a report with authorities stating that I had gone missing under circumstances they described as a miscommunication. They collected a life insurance payout on a policy they had taken out on me, something I learned only years later through some very uncomfortable paperwork my attorney helped me find. They had 2 more children after me, including a son. They had, by all appearances, simply continued their lives. They had not contacted me once in 26 years. Not when I graduated high school, not when I passed the bar, not when I was appointed judge, not when my father, my real father, the one who chose me, died. They contacted me 6 months after I inherited $3.8 million through a lawyer with a court filing. I called my attorney, a woman named Sheila, who I trust completely, and she walked me through the filing. She said, "I want you to hear me clearly. This case is almost no legal merit. They relinquished parental rights when you were placed in foster care. They have no biological claim to an estate from a man they never knew. What they're doing is a legal nuisance play. They're hoping you'll settle to make them go away." I said, "I'm not settling." She said, "I know. I just wanted to give you the option." I said, "What do we do?" She said, "We let them file, and then we answer." The case took 11 months to reach a hearing date. I want to skip over most of that because what I remember is mostly paperwork and phone calls and sitting across from Sheila in her office while she explained procedural timelines in the patient tone she uses when she thinks you're about to spiral. I did not spiral. I went to work every day. I heard cases. I applied law. I drove home. I watered Bernard's houseplants, which I had brought back with me after the funeral. But I knew the hearing date. I had it marked. And when Sheila called me 3 weeks out to give me the docket information, she paused before she told me the assigned courtroom. I knew what was coming before she said it. The case had been assigned to my court. My specific courtroom. My specific docket, by pure administrative accident, a scheduling rotation, random as a coin flip. My biological parents' lawsuit against me had landed on my bench. Sheila was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then she said, "I have to tell you something that's going to sound strange." I said, "I know." She said, "You know what I'm going to say?" I said, "I can't hear this case. Conflict of interest, I'll have to recuse." She said, "Correct, but here's what I want you to think about." I waited. She said, "Legally you cannot preside, but there is no rule that says you cannot be present as a party in the case, sitting at the respondent's table while another judge presides." She paused. "You don't have to hide, you just can't be on the bench." I thought about that for a long time. I thought about my biological parents in their respectable clothes, walking into a courthouse expecting to shake down the child they'd abandoned 26 years ago. I thought about Bernard's index card in my desk drawer. Then I called Sheila back and said, "File the recusal, and then tell me what time I need to be there." The morning of the hearing, I got up at 5:30. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with Bernard's index card and read it one more time. I put on a grey dress and my good heels. I drove to the courthouse. I was already at the respondent's table when they walked in. I didn't look up right away. I was reviewing documents with Sheila, but I felt the moment they saw me. I felt the shift in the room's energy, that particular hush that falls when something unexpected happens. I looked up then. My mother was wearing beige. My father had a clip-on tie. They looked at me like they were seeing something that wasn't supposed to be there. My mother turned to their attorney and said something in a low voice. The attorney looked at me and then away. They didn't know what I did for a living. That's the part I keep coming back to. In 26 years, they had never looked me up. They had found out about the inheritance through probate filings, the way people who pay attorneys to find money trails find things. But they had never Googled my name. They had never been curious enough about what became of the 6-year-old girl they left counting luggage in Knoxville to type 2 words into a search bar. If they had, they would have found the Hamilton County Court website. They would have found my photograph, my title, my judicial biography. They would have found out that the daughter they abandoned had become a judge in the very county where they chose to file their lawsuit. They found out the same way everyone else in the courtroom found out. The bailiff walked to the front of the room and said, in his full official voice, "All rise for the Honourable Judge Patricia Wren, presiding." And I stood up from the respondent's table, in my grey dress, in my good heels, without a robe. And my mother made a sound I will never forget. Not a word, just a sound. The presiding judge was a colleague I respected enormously. She handled the room with total calm. When she read the case summary aloud and it became clear to everyone present what exactly was being alleged, that these two people had a legal claim to an inheritance left to me by my adoptive father, there was an audible shift in the gallery. A few people looked from my parents to me and back again. My parents' attorney stood up and gave his opening argument. He talked about biological kinship. He talked about procedural standing. He talked around the obvious things, the abandonment, the insurance fraud, the 26 years of silence, with the practiced agility of someone being paid a lot of money to say things that aren't quite lies. Sheila stood up and made our response in 4 minutes. She said the petitioners voluntarily relinquished all parental rights. She said Bernard Hale had no biological or legal connection to the petitioners. She said the petitioners collected a life insurance payout based on a claim that the respondent had gone missing, a claim that was factually false. She said if the court wished, she was prepared to enter that life insurance documentation into evidence. The courtroom got very quiet. Judge Wren looked at my parents' attorney. She asked if he'd like to respond to the life insurance claim. There was a long pause. The attorney said he would need a brief recess to consult with his clients. Judge Wren said there would be no recess. Then my brother's name was called. I want to tell you about my brother, because he is the part of this story I didn't expect. His name was Denny. He was 2 years old when I was left at the bus station, so he has no memory of me from before. My parents had never told him about me, not the real version anyway. He found out the truth when he was 19 through some old paperwork he found in a box in the garage while helping my mother move. He spent years trying to find me. He hired a genealogy service. It took him 4 years. He found me 14 months before this hearing. He sent me a message through the court's administrative contact form, which is the only way he had to reach me, and he explained who he was and what he knew, and he said he was sorry, not on behalf of anyone else, just for himself, for the fact that this had happened. We had coffee once. It was uncomfortable and honest in equal measure. He cried at one point and I didn't, which surprised both of us. I told him the truth about Bernard. He listened without defending our parents. When we said goodbye in the parking lot, he hugged me and said he would do whatever I needed him to do. I hadn't expected to need him to do anything, but Sheila had called him 2 weeks before the hearing because it turned out that Denny had something important, the original box of paperwork from the garage. Inside it was a handwritten note from my mother to my father, dated the week I was abandoned, a note that laid out, in my mother's own handwriting, their plan. The bus station, the insurance policy, the story they would tell. Denny handed that box to Sheila without hesitation. He sat in the gallery on the day of the hearing, and he looked straight ahead the whole time, not at my parents, not at me, just straight ahead like someone walking through something they know they have to get through. When Sheila submitted the note into evidence, my mother turned and found Denny in the gallery. The look she gave him was the kind of look that belongs in private, in a family argument behind closed doors, not in a courtroom, not in front of strangers. She had miscalculated the cost of filing this lawsuit, and I think that was the moment she began to understand exactly how badly. Judge Wren dismissed the petition at 2:17 in the afternoon. She didn't do it quietly. She stated for the record that the claim had no legal standing, that the petitioners had voluntarily and legally relinquished parental rights decades prior, and that the documentation submitted by the respondent raised serious questions that she was referring to the district attorney's office for review. That last part landed like a stone in still water. My parents' attorney immediately began whispering. My mother had gone very pale. My father stared at the table. The life insurance fraud referral meant the DA would now decide whether to pursue charges. Sheila had explained this possibility to me months ago, and I had told her to submit everything we had, all of it, every document, every document, every dire amount. I had told myself that if I was going to be put through this, then I was going to do it completely and correctly and without holding anything back out of some residual feeling about people who had not extended me the same consideration. I don't know what the DA will ultimately decide. That is not my courtroom, and it is not my call to make. What I can tell you is that the referral was made, and that my parents were advised by their attorney, while I watched from 5 feet away, that they should speak to a criminal defense lawyer before doing anything else. My father looked at me when they said that. It was the first time he had looked directly at me since I sat down at the respondent's table. I don't know what he was looking for. I didn't have anything to give him. I held his gaze for a moment and then I looked away, because I was done. I drove home after the hearing. I changed into jeans and an old sweatshirt. I went out to the backyard and I sat on the porch steps for a long time. I thought about the bus station. I thought about the orange plastic chair and the purple pig in the coloring book and the cat ear jacket I never saw again. I thought about Bernard crouching in his garden in August. I thought about Denny sitting in that gallery looking straight ahead. I called him that night. He picked up immediately. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then he said, "You okay?" I said, "Getting there?" He said, "Me too." We talked for an hour. About nothing particularly important. About his job and my house plants and a road trip he was planning to the Pacific Northwest. It was the most normal conversation I'd had in months, and by the end of it, I was sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I realized I was smiling. I didn't set out to make this story about justice. I know that's the part people want. The gavel coming down, the bad people facing consequences, the clean moment of reversal. And some of that happened, I won't pretend it didn't. But what I keep coming back to is something smaller. Bernard used to say that the most important thing a person could do was to simply stay, to not leave, to be there when it would be easier not to be. He said most of the damage in the world was done by people who left. A stranger stayed with me in a bus station when I was 6 years old. He brought me home and he taught me what staying looked like. And then he gave me everything he had and trusted me to know what to do with it. I set up a fund. I named it the Staying Foundation because I couldn't think of anything more accurate, and Bernard would have found that funny. It provides legal representation for children in contested custody and foster care cases in Tennessee. Kids who need someone in their corner when the adults in the room are busy arguing about something other than them. I have a photograph of Bernard on my desk. It's from my law school graduation. He's standing next to me in his good blazer, squinting a little in the sun, and he looks, I keep trying to find the right word for it, proud isn't quite it. He looks like someone who was there for the right reasons and knew it. That's all I ever wanted to be. I used to think the hardest part of what happened to me was the moment itself. The orange plastic chair, the counting, the slowly dawning understanding that no one was coming back. But sitting in that courtroom as an adult, watching my biological parents realize who I had become, I understood that the hardest part was actually what came after. The choosing. Every single day, the choosing. Because here is what I know about cause and effect, not in any mystical sense, just in the plain observable way that one thing follows another. The actions people take leave marks. My biological parents made a calculation when I was 6 years old, and they spent 26 years living inside the version of reality that calculation created. A version where I was gone, where I didn't exist, where their choices had no weight, and then the world corrected the math, not through fate or some invisible hand, through documents, through court filings, through a brother who found a box in a garage and decided he couldn't live with what was inside it, through the simple fact that I had spent every year since that bus station becoming someone, quietly, without their knowledge or permission. Bernard never told me to be good. He didn't lecture. What he did was live a certain way in front of me, consistently, without exception. He told the truth even when it was inconvenient. He fixed what he broke. He stayed when leaving would have been easier. I watched him do this for years before I understood I was being taught something. The lesson wasn't about morality in the abstract. It was about the very practical reality that how you treat people is the infrastructure of your life. It holds everything else up. My biological parents' infrastructure had been rotting for 26 years. When they finally tried to stand on it again, it gave way. What I had by the time I walked into that courtroom was something I had built piece by piece without fully realizing I was building it. The ability to think clearly under pressure, to read a legal situation, to understand what documents meant and what they could do, that didn't come from talent. It came from years of discipline, from staying in the library when I would rather have gone home, from asking the next question even when I was tired. Clarity of mind is not a gift. It is the accumulated result of choosing to pay attention over and over, in small moments no one is watching. And the willingness to go through the hearing it all, to sit at that table, to put my name on those filings, to let Denny hand over that box. That required something I can only describe as deciding not to flinch. It would have been easier to settle. Sheila told me that. I knew it was true. The easier path was available and I turned it down. Not out of stubbornness, but out of a deep understanding that some things, once you walk away from them, you never fully get back. Denny called me a week after the hearing. He said he was doing okay. I believed him. We are figuring out, slowly and imperfectly, what it means to be related to each other outside the shadow of what our parents did. It is not a simple thing, but it is a real thing, and I would rather have something real and complicated than something easy and hollow. Bernard's photograph is still on my desk. I look at it on the days that are hard, and I think about a man who drove a 2009 Honda Civic and grew his own tomatoes, and quietly changed the entire trajectory of a life, mine, because he decided to stay. That is the only inheritance that actually mattered. The $3.8 million built a foundation, but the staying built me.